Tyrell Williams' sneakers squeaked softly against the cracked pavement as he pulled his second-hand delivery bike onto the narrow street. The Atlanta sun bore down unforgivingly, glaring off rows of old brick houses with peeling paint and rusted gutters. It was late afternoon, and the heat curled up from the road in shimmering waves. Tyrell adjusted the strap of his worn canvas delivery bag, already sagging with takeout orders, and took a steadying breath before pedaling toward his next stop. "Tyrell, slow down, boy. You'll wear yourself out," called a warm, familiar voice. Mrs. Jenkins sat behind the dusty window of her tiny corner store, her graying hair tied up in a faded bandana. She watched him like a mother hen, perched at the counter with an old fan whirring at her side. Tyrell grinned as he slowed just enough to wave. "I'm good, Miss Jenkins. Gotta make those deliveries on time. You tell your mama I put aside that bread she likes," Mrs. Jenkins called after him. "Don't you forget, hear me?" "I got you," he shouted over his shoulder, his voice trailing off as he pedaled faster. The bike rattled beneath him as he cut through the small streets of Southside Atlanta, weaving past kids playing stickball and old men in folding chairs watching the world go by. Each familiar face greeted him, and Tyrell waved back with ease. He was their boy, the kid with the big dreams and the bigger smile. At just 20, Tyrell carried more weight than most. His mother, Gloria Williams, had raised him alone since he was a baby. She worked as a house cleaner in the wealthier suburbs, leaving early in the morning and returning home late, her hands cracked from cleaning products and endless scrubbing. Despite their modest life, a two-bedroom house that leaked when it rained, thrift store furniture, and patched-up windows, Gloria had made their little home a sanctuary. Tyrell worked hard to help her. Between his part-time delivery job and odd repairs for neighbors, he made just enough to keep the lights on. But Gloria always pushed him to dream beyond their struggles. "You're gonna make it, Ty," she would tell him, her voice soft but determined as she packed his lunch before school. "I didn't work this hard for you to stop here. You hear me?" "I hear you, Mama," he'd say, even when doubt gnawed at him. That night, after his last delivery, Tyrell pedaled home. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in purples and oranges. Their little house sat tucked between two overgrown lots, its porch light flickering faintly. As he walked inside, the smell of fried chicken greeted him, his favorite. "Evening, Mama," Tyrell said, dropping his bag on the kitchen table. Gloria looked up from the stove. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back, and a tired smile creased her face. "Look at you, working yourself to death. You hungry?" "Always," Tyrell said, sliding into the chair that wobbled slightly. Gloria sat across from him after plating their meal. She watched him carefully as he ate, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the table. "You're quiet tonight, baby. What's on your mind?" "Nothing, Mama. Just thinking, about what?" Tyrell paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He glanced at her hands that had given him everything, yet had never been allowed to rest. "You ever wish for more?" Gloria tilted her head. "More. I have more than enough. I've got you, but I mean more than this. A real house. No leaks. A place where you don't have to work so hard anymore." She smiled softly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Baby, we're blessed. You don't worry about me. Your job is to dream big, bigger than this whole neighborhood." That night, Tyrell sat on the front stoop, his knees pulled up to his chest. The air was cooler now, and the hum of crickets filled the silence. He stared at the city skyline in the distance, where the lights of downtown Atlanta glittered like jewels. Those towers, those lives, felt so far away. Someday, he whispered to himself, someday, I'm gonna make it so she never has to work another day in her life. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when. But Tyrell Williams had a promise to keep. The next afternoon, the summer heat felt even more relentless. Tyrell adjusted his cap as he pushed his bike up a long, winding road outside the city. His latest delivery had sent him far past his usual routes, into a more secluded part of town where the houses were miles apart, and the trees grew thick and wild on either side of the road. The silence out here was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "This better be worth the tip," he muttered to himself, sweat dripping down his face as he pedaled harder. It was then that he saw it. At first, just a dark shape through the glare of the sun. But as he rode closer, Tyrell's eyes widened. A black luxury SUV had veered off the road, its front smashed against a thick tree. Smoke curled ominously from the hood, and one of the wheels still spun weakly, as if the accident had just happened. Tyrell skidded his bike to a stop, his heart pounding. The sight of the wreck made his stomach twist, but instinct pushed him forward. Dropping his bike on the gravel shoulder, he sprinted toward the vehicle. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the stillness. From inside the car, a faint voice answered, frantic and panicked. "Help. Someone, please." Tyrell reached the passenger window and peered inside. The woman in the front seat looked to be in her early 30s, with blonde hair plastered to her forehead, her face pale with fear. Her hands shook as she pounded weakly on the window. But what caught Tyrell's eye and made his chest tighten was her round, swollen belly. She was pregnant. "Hold on, ma'am. I'm going to get you out," Tyrell shouted. He tried the passenger door first, yanking the handle with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. The frame had crumpled from the impact. The woman's eyes were wide with terror, darting between Tyrell and the smoke now billowing out of the hood. "The car, it's going to catch fire," she cried, her voice trembling. Tyrell looked around desperately. The rising smoke hissed and popped, and the acrid smell burned his throat. There was no time. Without another word, he pulled off his jacket, wrapped it around his arm, and smashed his elbow against the passenger window. The glass didn't break. "Come on, man, come on," he muttered, his pulse thundering in his ears. He hit the window again, this time harder. The glass cracked, spiderwebbing out from impact. With one final blow, it shattered. "Cover your face," Tyrell shouted as shards rained down. The woman shielded herself as best as she could, coughing through the smoke that was now seeping into the cabin. Tyrell reached inside, carefully unbuckling her seatbelt as she whimpered in pain. "Can you move? I'm going to help you, okay?" She nodded weakly, tears streaking through the soot on her face. Tyrell leaned in, ignoring the heat from the engine that seared against his skin. With as much care as possible, he pulled her through the broken window, lifting her into his arms. "Hold on to me," he said firmly. She clung to him as he stumbled away from the vehicle, his muscles straining beneath her weight. The smoke turned thick and black behind them, and then, boom, the SUV exploded in a burst of fire and sound. Tyrell instinctively turned his back to shield the woman as the blast wave rushed over them. Heat licked at his shoulders, and ash floated like snowflakes in the air. For a moment, everything was still. The roar of the explosion gave way to silence, broken only by the woman's ragged breathing. Tyrell gently set her down on the grass a safe distance away. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, crouching beside her. The woman looked up at him, her wide eyes still glassy with shock. Her hands trembled as they hovered protectively over her belly. You saved me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Tyrell let out a shaky breath, his adrenaline finally starting to fade. He managed a small, reassuring smile. "It's gonna be okay. Help's coming. Just breathe, all right?" The woman clutched his hand suddenly, holding it tight in her own. "Thank you," she said, tears spilling over her cheeks. "Thank you so much." Tyrell nodded softly, his own chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air, growing louder with every second. "Help's here," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. He looked back at the smoldering wreckage of the SUV, the flames still crackling hungrily. A chill ran down his spine as he realized how close they'd come to death. The woman's grip on his hand loosened as she finally lay back on the grass, safe but exhausted. Tyrell sat beside her, wiping sweat and soot from his forehead, his mind spinning. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, his decision to act, to save a stranger, would change his life forever. The wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the heavy stillness of the aftermath. Red and blue lights flickered across the broken tree line as emergency vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars roared onto the scene. Tyrell turned his head toward the commotion, his chest still heaving from exhaustion. The woman, still lying on the grass, stirred weakly and blinked at the bright, flashing lights. Tyrell stayed close, his soot-covered hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Help's here," he murmured again, though his voice sounded distant, even to himself. Paramedics rushed toward them, their voices urgent. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Can you tell us where it hurts?" One of the medics turned to Tyrell. "You okay, kid? Are you injured?" Tyrell shook his head, though his body ached and his skin stung where the heat of the explosion had brushed him. "I'm fine. Help her first." He stepped back as the medics swarmed around the woman, their hands working swiftly to stabilize her. One of them carefully placed a hand on her stomach. "She's pregnant," Tyrell said quickly, his voice hoarse. "Make sure she's okay." "We've got it under control, son," the medic assured him. Tyrell stumbled a few steps back, his legs weak as the adrenaline ebbed away. He watched as they loaded her onto a stretcher, her pale face turning toward him one last time. She reached out a trembling hand. "Don't go." Before he could respond, someone caught his eye. From a sleek black SUV that had just pulled up, a man stepped out hurriedly. Tyrell recognized him immediately. He'd seen the face on news reports, in interviews, and even in online articles he'd scrolled through on his beat-up phone. Elon Musk. Dressed in a simple dark suit, his hair slightly disheveled, Elon moved with an urgency that surprised Tyrell. Security guards flanked him, but they struggled to keep up as Elon made a beeline for the stretcher. His face, usually so composed in public, was lined with panic. "Claire." Elon's voice was rough, breathless. He fell to his knees beside the stretcher, his hands finding hers as paramedics reassured him. "She's stable, Mr. Musk," one of them said. "She's going to be okay, but we need to get her to the hospital now." Claire, her voice faint but steady, squeezed his hand weakly. "I'm okay. The baby's okay." Elon's shoulders sagged with relief, but his sharp gaze darted around the scene until it landed on Tyrell. The teenager stood frozen near the smoldering wreckage, his shirt torn, his hands blackened with soot, and his face streaked with sweat. One of Elon's security guards approached him, his voice low and firm. "Were you here when the crash happened?" Tyrell swallowed hard, suddenly self-conscious under the weight of everyone's attention. "Yeah," he said quietly. I pulled her out." The guard's brows lifted in surprise, but before he could say anything else, Elon Musk rose to his feet. He walked straight to Tyrell, his gaze sharp yet filled with something Tyrell couldn't quite place. Respect, maybe even disbelief. "You save her?" Elon asked, his voice steady but low. Tyrell rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable under the intense scrutiny. I just did what anyone would have done, sir." Elon's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the young man in front of him. Tyrell could see the billionaire's mind working, taking in every detail. The ripped clothes, the soot-covered face, the old sneakers worn down from miles of pedaling. Finally, Elon stepped closer and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with sincerity. Tyrell hesitated, staring at the man's outstretched hand. He'd never been this close to someone so powerful, someone who existed in a world far removed from his own. Finally, he shook Elon's hand, feeling the firm grip. "It was nothing," Tyrell muttered, shrugging. Elon let go and shook his head slowly. "It wasn't nothing. You risked your life to save mine and my wife's. I don't even know your name." "Tyrell. Tyrell Williams." "Well, Tyrell," Elon said, his voice softening. You're a hero today." Tyrell glanced down at his scuffed shoes, shaking his head. "I'm not a hero. I couldn't leave her there." The distant rumble of a helicopter broke the silence. Tyrell looked up to see it circling overhead before landing 100 yards away. The medics began rolling Claire toward the waiting ambulance. Elon turned to follow, but before he did, he placed a hand on Tyrell's shoulder. "I won't forget this," he said firmly, locking eyes with the young man. "You have my word." With that, Elon walked toward the ambulance, leaving Tyrell standing alone amid the chaos. He watched as the vehicles pulled away, their sirens fading into the distance. The wreckage still smoldered behind him, black smoke curling into the pale blue sky. Tyrell's hands shook as he picked up his bike, the events of the past hour replaying over and over in his head. "Hero," he whispered to himself as he pushed the bike back toward the road. The word felt strange, like it didn't belong to him. As he pedaled slowly back toward home, his mind spun with everything that had happened. He'd saved a woman's life, Elon Musk's wife, and for the first time in his life, Tyrell felt like he'd been part of something bigger. What he didn't realize was that this moment, this simple act of courage, was about to change everything. Tyrell spent the evening replaying the day in his mind, every detail sharp and vivid. The explosion, the woman's trembling hands, Elon Musk's piercing gaze. It all felt surreal, like he'd stepped into someone else's story. He'd managed to make it home just before sundown, though his body ached, and his clothes still carried the smell of smoke. His mother, Gloria, had noticed his strange demeanor over dinner. "You okay, baby?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Yeah, Mama," Tyrell said, forcing a tired smile. "Just a long day." He didn't say anything more. How could he explain that he'd saved a stranger, Elon Musk's pregnant wife, no less? It felt too big, too unbelievable. So instead, he quietly cleared his plate and went to bed, staring at the cracked ceiling as the sounds of their neighborhood buzzed outside. The next morning, Tyrell was up early. His muscles still protested as he moved, but he had deliveries to make. It was business as usual, or so he thought. He'd barely stepped onto the sidewalk when the rumble of engines caught his attention. Tyrell turned, his eyes widening as a sleek convoy of black SUVs rounded the corner, crawling down the narrow street like something out of a movie. Heads turned. Neighbors peeked out windows. Kids dropped their bikes and stared, mouths open. No one ever saw cars like that around here. Certainly not in this part of town. The SUVs slowed to a stop right in front of Tyrell's small house. The doors opened simultaneously, and out stepped men in dark suits. Tyrell froze, gripping the strap of his delivery bag as the neighbors began to gather around, whispering. Then, from the center vehicle, Elon Musk emerged. He wore a crisp navy suit, his expression serious, yet calm, as his gaze found Tyrell instantly. "Tyrell Williams," Elon called out, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Tyrell blinked, unsure of what to do. He glanced nervously at the small crowd forming behind him. Yeah, that's me." Elon nodded and approached, his stride purposeful. His security details stayed back, though their presence loomed. The billionaire extended his hand once again, this time with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good to see you again," Elon said. Tyrell shook his hand awkwardly, suddenly hyper-aware of his worn-out sneakers and faded t-shirt. "Good to see you too, Mr. Musk. What are you doing here?" The neighbors gasped as Elon Musk smiled faintly and turned to address them. "I'm here because this young man, your neighbor, saved my wife's life yesterday. He risked everything to pull her out of a burning car, and I owe him a debt I can't ever fully repay." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins, holding a plastic shopping bag, placed a hand over her heart. "My lord," she whispered. Tyrell felt his face heat up. "It wasn't a big deal, sir," he mumbled. Elon turned back to Tyrell, his gaze steady. "It was a big deal, Tyrell. You did something extraordinary." Before Tyrell could protest, Elon reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He held out toward him. "This is for you," Elon said firmly. Tyrell hesitated, looking at the envelope, like it might burn him. "What is it?" "Let's call it a reward. I want to thank you properly." Tyrell shook his head, backing up a step. "I don't need that, sir." The crowd fell silent. Even Elon looked momentarily taken aback. "You don't even know what's inside," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I don't need to," Tyrell replied, meeting Elon's gaze with quiet resolve. "I didn't do it for money." Elon frowned slightly, tilting his head as he studied the young man. "You saved my wife and my unborn child. Whatever's in this envelope, it's the least I can do." Tyrell shifted uncomfortably, feeling everyone's eyes on him. He glanced back at his house, where the curtains twitched slightly. His mother was watching. Taking a deep breath, Tyrell looked back at Elon and said softly, "If I could ask for something, it wouldn't be for me." Elon's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Tyrell swallowed, his voice steady despite his nerves. "My mom, she's the hardest working person I know. She raised me on her own. She spent her whole life cleaning houses for other people who don't even see her." Elon listened intently, his expression unreadable. Tyrell continued, his words coming out in a rush. "She's never had anything of her own. Not a real home, not a break from working all the time. If I could ask for anything, it'd be for her to finally have a place. Somewhere she doesn't have to worry about leaks or broken windows. Somewhere she can rest." For a moment, no one said anything. The crowd behind them was silent, the only sound the soft hum of an idling engine. Elon's gaze didn't waver as he studied Tyrell. "You're saying you don't want anything for yourself?" Elon asked finally, his voice soft but curious. Tyrell shrugged. "I don't need much, sir. Just seeing her happy would mean everything to me." Elon blinked, his sharp features softening slightly. He glanced toward the house, where Gloria was now standing on the porch, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "What's her name?" Elon asked quietly. "Gloria Williams," Tyrell said. Elon nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "All right, Tyrell." His voice was firm, but kind. "If that's what you want, I'll make sure your mom gets the home she deserves." Tyrell's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean it?" "I don't make promises I can't keep," Elon said, offering a faint smile. "You've given my family a gift I can never repay. The least I can do is take care of yours." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins wiped a tear from her eye. Tyrell stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "No, thank you, Tyrell." As Elon turned back to his convoy, Tyrell stood rooted to the spot, his heart racing. The crowd erupted into murmurs and cheers, but he barely heard them. All he could think about was his mother, her tired hands, her long days of scrubbing floors, and how, for the first time, he could give something back to her. And this was only the beginning. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden hues across the street as Tyrell sat on the edge of his porch. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only whispers in their wake, but Tyrell's mind still raced. The moment felt unreal. Elon Musk had promised his mother a home. It was too big to grasp, like trying to hold sunlight in his hands. Tyrell. His mother's soft voice pulled him from his daze. Gloria stood in the doorway, still in her cleaning uniform, a faded blue dress with bleach-stained hems. Her face, lined with years of struggle, carried a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on, baby? Who were those people?" Tyrell's throat tightened. How could he explain this? How could he tell her that everything might change? That for once, life might give her something back? "Sit down, Mama," he said quietly, gesturing to the step beside him. Gloria hesitated, glancing toward the empty street where the convoy had disappeared. Finally, she sighed and lowered herself onto the porch beside him, her knees creaking faintly. "Lord, you've got me worried. Did you get in trouble?" "No, Mama," Tyrell said quickly, shaking his head. "It's not like that." He paused, rubbing his hands together nervously. Something happened yesterday, and it's kind of a long story. She watched him closely, her eyes narrowing. Tell me. Tyrell took a deep breath. I was making a delivery out by the woods, near that big winding road. There was a crash. An SUV hit a tree. I didn't think. He swallowed hard. I pulled the woman out. She was trapped, and the car caught fire. I got her out just before it exploded. Gloria's hand flew to her mouth. Jesus, Tyrell, are you okay? Were you hurt? I'm fine, Mama. I promise. Her face was pale as she scanned him for injuries, shaking her head in disbelief. You risked your life. She was pregnant, Tyrell said softly. I couldn't leave her there. Gloria's shoulders sagged, her hand resting over her heart. She looked up at the sky, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." Then her gaze turned back to him, fierce and motherly. You could have died, Tyrell. What if something had happened to you? What would I? Mama, Tyrell interrupted gently, placing his hand over hers. It's okay. I'm here. She blinked back tears, nodding slowly. All right. What about those people today? Who was that man? Tyrell hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The woman I saved. She's married to someone important. Elon Musk. Gloria froze, her brow furrowing. Elon Musk? That Elon Musk. She stared at him, speechless. The name hung in the air, like something too big to touch. Finally, she whispered, "Why was he here?" Tyrell smiled faintly. He wanted to thank me. He offered me a reward. Gloria's hand gripped his tightly. You didn't take it, did you? You didn't take his money. I didn't, Tyrell said softly, shaking his head. But I asked him for something else. What? Tyrell turned to face her, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. I told him about you, about how hard you've worked your whole life. I told him you've spent every day cleaning other people's houses, working yourself to the bone, just so I could have a chance. Gloria's lip trembled as she stared at him. Tyrell, you didn't. I did, Mama, Tyrell said firmly. I told him you've never had a real home, a place that's yours, a place where you don't have to patch holes in the walls or mop up rainwater from the leaks. I asked him to give you that. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. Baby, you shouldn't have done that. I don't need. Yes, you do, Tyrell said, his voice breaking. You deserve it. All my life, you've worked so hard. You gave me everything, even when you had nothing. I see you, Mama. I see how tired you are, how you smile at me even when I know you're in pain. You've spent your whole life taking care of me, and now it's my turn to take care of you. Gloria covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as quiet sobs escaped her. Tyrell put his arm around her, holding her close. Don't cry, Mama, he whispered. It's gonna be okay now, I promise. For a long time, they sat there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing around them. Finally, Gloria looked up, wiping her tears with the edge of her sleeve. What did he say? She asked, her voice hoarse. Tyrell smiled faintly. He said he's gonna take care of it. He promised. Gloria stared at him, as if trying to process what she'd just heard. Her face was etched with disbelief, but a flicker of hope shone in her eyes. A home, for me, for us, Tyrell corrected softly. She let out a shaky breath, looking up at the sky as tears continued to slip down her cheeks. Oh, Lord, she whispered. Is this real? It's real, Mama, Tyrell said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. It's finally real. The sun had dipped lower now, casting a warm golden glow across their small house. It was still the same, faded paint cracked, windows and a sagging roof. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a prison to Tyrell. It felt like the beginning of something new. The next morning, Tyrell sat at the kitchen table, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the chipped edges of a mug. Gloria moved around the room slowly, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Though her body moved with its usual rhythm, her eyes carried a faraway look, one of disbelief, of hope she didn't dare hold too tightly. Tyrell hadn't said much after their conversation the night before. He didn't know how to explain the feeling twisting in his chest, that this was all too much, too good to be true. Then came the knock at the door. Who could that be? Gloria asked, glancing toward the porch. Tyrell rose slowly, his stomach tightening. As he opened the door, the sunlight spilled inside, and there stood Elon Musk, flanked by two men in tailored suits. He held no grand airs, no arrogance, just a calm, almost casual presence that seemed so out of place against the peeling paint of the Williams' front porch. "Good morning, Tyrell," Elon said, offering a small nod. "May I come in?" Tyrell froze, the words catching in his throat. He stepped aside wordlessly, and Elon entered the small living room, his polished shoes tapping lightly on the worn linoleum floor. Gloria appeared from the kitchen, her apron still tied around her waist, her face stricken with shock. "Good morning, ma'am," Elon said, smiling faintly as he extended his hand. "Elon Musk, it's an honor to meet you." Gloria hesitated, glancing at Tyrell before taking his hand cautiously. "I know who you are," she said softly, "but what are you doing here?" Elon turned toward Tyrell, his expression serious. "I'm here to keep my promise." Tyrell's heart skipped a beat. "You mean?" Elon nodded, cutting him off gently. "Tyrell told me about you yesterday, Mrs. Williams, about the sacrifices you've made, the hard work, and the love you've poured into raising him. You're an extraordinary woman, and it's clear you've raised an extraordinary son." Gloria blinked rapidly, her hand trembling as she clutched the edge of her apron. "I don't understand. I want to give you what you deserve," Elon continued, his voice steady but warm. "A real home, a place where you can rest, where you don't have to worry about leaks, peeling paint, or broken windows. A home that belongs to you and no one else." Gloria took a step back, her hand flying to her chest. "A home." Her voice cracked on the words. "Yes," Elon said simply. "I've already made arrangements. My team will take care of everything. Finding the perfect place, handling the paperwork, furnishing it. All you have to do is say yes." Tyrell stared at Elon, unable to find his voice. The words hung in the air like something fragile, something too precious to touch. He glanced at his mother, who was trembling as tears welled in her eyes. "Why?" Gloria whispered, shaking her head. "Why would you do this for us?" Elon's expression softened. He glanced at Tyrell before answering. "Because your son saved my family. My wife, Claire, and our unborn child wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. He risked his life for people he didn't even know. And when I tried to reward him, he didn't ask for money or fame. He asked for you to have a home. That kind of selflessness is rare, Mrs. Williams, and it deserves to be honored." Gloria let out a shaky breath, her tears falling freely now. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. She turned to Tyrell, her voice breaking. "You did this for me." Tyrell nodded, his throat tight. "You've done everything for me, Mama. It's your turn now." She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as her sobs shook her small frame. Tyrell closed his eyes, burying his face in her shoulder, his own tears threatening to spill. For so long, he had dreamed of this moment, of seeing his mother's pain lifted, even if just a little. Elon stood quietly, giving them space. When Gloria finally pulled back, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron, she looked at Elon and said softly, "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Musk. This is too much." "It's not," Elon said firmly. "Not for you, and not for him." He turned to Tyrell then, his sharp gaze meeting the young man's. "You asked for something humble, Tyrell, something that spoke to who you are and where you come from. But I want you to know something. This is just the beginning. You deserve more than you realize." Tyrell frowned slightly, confused. "What do you mean?" Elon's smile was faint, but genuine. "Let's focus on the house first. My team will be in touch. I'll make sure you see it soon." He glanced at his watch and stepped back toward the door, his tone softening. "You've earned this, both of you." As Elon turned to leave, Gloria called after him, "Mr. Musk." He paused, turning back with a questioning look. "Bless you," she said quietly, "for seeing my son the way I do." Elon's expression shifted just slightly. A flicker of something deep and unspoken passed over his features. He nodded once before stepping outside, the sunlight catching on his suit as he disappeared into the waiting SUV. When the cars finally rolled away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake, Gloria sank into the couch, her hands still trembling. Did that really happen? Tyrell dropped onto the floor, leaning his back against the couch as he stared at the door. "Yeah, Mama, it really did." For the first time in a long time, he let himself believe it was possible, that the weight of their struggles might finally lift. And as he sat there, his mother's hand resting gently on his shoulder, Tyrell allowed himself a smile. A home. It was more than bricks and paint. It was everything they'd ever dreamed of. The sun was high by the time the convoy disappeared from sight, leaving behind only tire marks on the dusty road and a ripple of whispers through the neighborhood. It didn't take long for word to spread like wildfire. Elon Musk had come to Southside Atlanta, and no one could stop talking about it. But inside the small Williams home, the air was still, quiet. Tyrell sat at the kitchen table, his back straight, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Across from him, his mother stood at the counter, her movements slow and deliberate as she rinsed dishes. Neither of them spoke. Gloria's face was unreadable, but Tyrell could feel her glancing at him every now and then. He knew her well enough to know what she was thinking. It was the same thing he was thinking. How can this be real? Finally, Gloria set down the last plate and turned to him, drying her hands on her apron. "You didn't tell me about the accident." Tyrell looked up, meeting her gaze. "Didn't seem like the kind of thing you brag about, Mama." "Brag," she said, frowning slightly. "You saved a woman's life, Tyrell. You don't think that's worth telling your own mother?" He shrugged, his fingers tracing an invisible line on the table. "I don't know. I wasn't looking for anyone to thank me." Gloria moved closer, lowering herself into the chair across from him. Her eyes, though tired, searched his face carefully. "Baby, what you did, what you've done, it's not small. It's not something you hide away, like it doesn't matter. It's just..." Tyrell paused, looking away. "I don't want people treating me different, Mama. I don't want them acting like I'm some kind of hero." Gloria sighed softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Tyrell, the world doesn't always show kindness to boys like you. When it does, when it sees your worth, don't you dare hide from it." Tyrell swallowed, her words settling deep in his chest. "It doesn't feel real yet. Any of it." Gloria smiled faintly, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. But you listen to me, Tyrell. You're my son. And whatever happens next, you keep being who you are. That's what got us here. Your heart, your kindness. Don't let anybody change that." Tyrell nodded quietly. "Yes, ma'am." That evening, Tyrell sat on the edge of the bed in his small room. The light outside had faded into a warm dusk, casting orange streaks across his faded posters and the secondhand books stacked in the corner. He stared at his hands, still faintly marked with soot from the accident 2 days before. The memory played in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. The woman's voice, the heat of the flames, the sound of the car exploding just moments after he'd pulled her free. Hero. He heard the word echo in his head, though it didn't sit right with him. Heroes were people in movies, people who wore capes or had powers. He was just Tyrell, a kid who delivered takeout to keep the lights on and who rode a bike because a car was out of reach. A soft knock broke him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Gloria stepped inside, holding a small tray with a sandwich and a glass of milk. "You didn't eat much at dinner," she said, setting it on the nightstand. "Thanks, Mama." She hesitated in the doorway, watching him for a moment. "Tyrell, yeah, you sure you're okay?" He looked up, forcing a smile. "I'm good, Mama. Just thinking about everything." She nodded, though her eyes lingered on him. "Try to get some rest, baby. Tomorrow's a new day." When she closed the door behind her, Tyrell lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling as the quiet of the house settled around him. Outside, faint laughter echoed from kids playing in the street, and the hum of a passing car drifted through the window. It was the same as it always was, and yet nothing felt the same. Hours later, Tyrell's phone buzzed on his nightstand. The old, cracked screen lit up with a notification. He reached for it, his brow furrowing as he opened a news alert. Billionaire Elon Musk's wife rescued from fiery crash. Atlanta teen saves the day. Tyrell's heart skipped a beat as he read the headline, his name printed boldly in the opening lines. Attached was a grainy photo someone must have snapped from the scene. The burning car in the background, smoke billowing, and him kneeling beside Claire, holding her hand. He sat up, his breath catching. He could already imagine what this would mean. Tomorrow, his quiet world wouldn't be quiet anymore. Tyrell switched off the phone and lay back down, turning toward the wall. He closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on his chest. For now, he decided he wouldn't say a word. It was an ordinary morning in Southside Atlanta. The air was warm, buzzing with the usual sounds of the neighborhood. Lawnmowers humming, dogs barking, kids yelling as they played in the cracked streets. Tyrell sat at the kitchen table, tapping his fingers against the wood as Gloria tidied up around the house. She hummed a gospel tune, her voice light, but Tyrell could see the new glint in her eye. Hope. Though she tried to keep it tucked away, it lingered in the way she moved, as if she wasn't as tired as usual. Tyrell, finish your eggs before they get cold, she said, swatting at him gently with a dishcloth. Yes, ma'am, Tyrell mumbled, his fork scraping the plate. Then it happened. The low, unmistakable rumble of engines. It wasn't the familiar sound of old cars sputtering through their street or the occasional delivery truck. This sound was polished, powerful, and out of place. Gloria's humming stopped. What on earth? Tyrell's fork paused midair as he turned his head toward the front window. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped abruptly just outside their house. Tyrell shouted a voice from outside. Boy, get out here quick. He shot up from his chair and rushed to the window, his heart pounding. Outside, the street had transformed into a scene that didn't belong. Parked right in front of their house were 3 black SUVs, their glossy exteriors reflecting the sunlight. Men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the street like something out of a movie. A murmur spread through the neighborhood as people emerged from their houses, craning their necks to see what was happening. Kids abandoned their bikes, mothers whispered to one another, and Mr. Harris, who sat on his porch every day like a sentry, removed his cap and squinted at the convoy. Is that the police? Gloria whispered behind Tyrell, her voice tight. No, Mama, Tyrell said quietly, his throat dry. It's them. Before she could ask anything more, the center SUV's door opened, and out stepped Elon Musk. He was dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, his movements calm and purposeful as he adjusted his jacket and looked around. The neighborhood fell silent. People stared in awe, whispers breaking like ripples in a pond. That ain't who I think it is, Mr. Harris muttered, leaning forward. Is that Elon Musk? Someone else gasped. Tyrell's stomach turned as Elon's sharp blue eyes locked onto their house. Before he knew it, Elon was walking up the small, worn path that led to their porch, his polished shoes clicking softly against the concrete. Tyrell Williams, he called out, his voice loud enough to carry over the gathering crowd. Tyrell froze. Gloria gripped his arm, her fingers trembling. Baby, why is that man here? I don't. Tyrell started, but his voice failed him. Elon Musk stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, a slight smile softening his otherwise serious face. Good morning, he said, looking up at Tyrell and Gloria. May I come in? Before either of them could answer, Mrs. Jenkins' voice cut through the crowd. Lord have mercy, Elon Musk is in our neighborhood. A ripple of laughter and nervous excitement spread, but Elon's attention stayed fixed on the Williams family. Gloria, still gripping Tyrell's arm, swallowed hard and nodded faintly. Of course, please come in. The small living room seemed even smaller with Elon Musk in it. He stood tall and out of place against their thrift store furniture, the faint hum of conversation still audible from the crowd outside. Gloria sat stiffly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. Tyrell stood by the door, unsure whether to sit or stay standing. "Mr. Musk," Gloria started, her voice soft but steady. "What brings you all the way here?" Elon's faint smile returned. "I'm here to keep my word." Tyrell's heart thudded loudly in his chest. Elon turned toward him. "Tyrell, yesterday I told you that your mother would have a home, a real home. My team has already taken care of everything. We found a house not far from here. It's fully furnished, safe, and ready for you to move in." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Gloria blinked rapidly, shaking her head as though trying to clear her hearing. "What?" Elon turned to her, his tone gentle but firm. "Mrs. Williams, the house is yours. No rent, no payments. It belongs to you." Gloria's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled from her eyes. "A home. For me." Elon nodded. "For you. And for Tyrell." Tyrell stared at him, struggling to breathe. "You're serious?" "I never make promises I can't keep," Elon replied simply. "My team will take you to see it today. If there's anything you want changed, we'll take care of it." Gloria's sobs broke the silence. She buried her face in her hands, whispering through her tears, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you." Tyrell dropped onto the couch, his legs unable to hold him any longer. He looked up at Elon, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Elon's expression softened. "Because what you did, Tyrell, wasn't just brave. It was selfless. You saved my family, and when I tried to repay you, you asked for nothing for yourself. That's rare. The least I can do is make sure you and your mother have what you deserve." Gloria reached out blindly for Tyrell's hand, gripping it tightly as she wept. "Baby, we have a home." Tyrell couldn't speak. His throat burned, and his vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. For so long, he dreamed of this moment, of seeing his mother finally at peace, no longer carrying the weight of their struggles alone. Elon turned to leave, his polished shoes clicking softly against the worn floorboards. Before stepping outside, he paused and glanced back. "Tyrell," he said, his voice steady, "you've proven that one person's kindness can change everything. Never forget that." With that, he stepped outside, greeted by the eager crowd waiting for him. Tyrell sat frozen beside his mother, the tears finally spilling over as the reality of it all sank in. A home. The first time in his life. The weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The day was brighter than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. The convoy of black SUVs moved slowly through a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Atlanta, where tree-lined streets curved gently around well-kept lawns and cozy houses with freshly painted shutters. It was a far cry from Southside, a place Gloria Williams had only seen in passing, a place she never dared dream of living. Tyrell sat in the back seat of the center SUV, staring out the window in silence. He couldn't shake the feeling in his chest, a mix of disbelief, anticipation, and something else he couldn't name. His mother sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much during the ride, but her eyes, wide and glistening, were fixed on the road ahead as though afraid to blink and lose this moment. "Are we really going there, Tyrell?" she whispered suddenly, breaking the silence. He turned to her, offering a small smile. "Yeah, Mama, we're really going." The car slowed, turning onto a quiet cul-de-sac. The houses here were pristine, each one unique but charming in its own way. Tyrell's heart thudded in his chest as he watched one of Elon Musk's men step out of the lead vehicle and signal for their car to stop. "Here we are," the driver said calmly. Gloria's hand shot out to grip Tyrell's arm as the door opened. "Lord, help me," she murmured under her breath. Tyrell climbed out first, his legs unsteady. When he turned back to offer his mother a hand, the look on her face made his throat tighten. She stepped out slowly, her eyes fixed on the house in front of them, their house. It was a two-story craftsman-style home with a broad, welcoming porch and blue shutters that matched the trim. A wreath hung on the freshly painted front door, and flower beds lined the walkway, blooming in vibrant yellows and pinks. The lawn was lush and green, and the driveway was empty except for the SUVs that had brought them there. For a moment, Gloria couldn't move. She just stood there, her free hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. This can't be ours," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tyrell swallowed hard, blinking against his own tears. "Is, Mama. It's ours." Elon Musk stepped forward from the second car, his presence understated but commanding. He smiled faintly, gesturing toward the house. "Welcome home, Mrs. Williams." Tyrell. Gloria turned to him, her voice shaking as she said, "Mr. Musk, I don't even know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Elon replied gently. "Everything inside has been taken care of. The house is fully furnished, and there's plenty of space for both of you. All you have to do now is enjoy it." Gloria shook her head slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I've never seen anything like this. Not in my wildest dreams." Tyrell stepped beside her, placing his hand on her back as she broke down in quiet sobs. He looked up at the house, his chest aching in a way he couldn't quite describe. It was beautiful, so much more than he had ever imagined. "Would you like to see inside?" Elon asked softly. Gloria nodded, unable to speak. The front door creaked open, revealing a warm, inviting living room. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, bouncing off the polished hardwood floors and soft, cream-colored furniture. A large rug spread across the floor, and framed pictures of calming landscapes hung on the walls. "Lord have mercy," Gloria whispered, her hand still trembling against her lips. Tyrell followed her, his eyes darting from the new leather couches to the bookshelves that lined one wall. He ran his hand over the smooth wood of the dining table, his fingertips catching on its glossy finish. Everything was perfect, spotless, new and waiting for them. They moved from room to room slowly, as though afraid they might wake up from a dream. The kitchen was spacious, with gleaming countertops and modern appliances Tyrell had only seen in commercials. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms. One for his mother, one for him, and a third that Elon had jokingly called for guests or future possibilities. When Gloria stepped into the master bedroom, she stopped at the doorway, her body shaking. The bed was large and inviting, covered with a soft quilt and perfectly plumped pillows. A window overlooked the backyard, where a wooden porch swing hung from the trees. Tyrell stood quietly behind her, his own chest tight as he watched her take all in. "Is this really for me?" she choked out, turning back to him. "It's all yours, Mama," Tyrell whispered. Gloria sank down onto the edge of the bed, her tears falling freely. "I don't deserve this," she whispered through her sobs. "I don't deserve any of this." Tyrell dropped to his knees in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Yes, you do, Mama. You've worked your whole life for this. You gave everything for me, even when you didn't have anything left. You deserve a place to rest, a place to be happy." She cupped his face in, her hands, her tears mixing with laughter now. "My boy, my sweet boy." Tyrell pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the reality of it all settled over them. For the first time in his life, he felt like they'd won. Like the world had finally given something back to his mother for all her years of sacrifice. Elon stood quietly in the hallway, watching the two of them. His expression was calm, but his eyes were thoughtful, even moved. One of his assistants approached him cautiously. "Mr. Musk, we're ready to leave whenever you are." Elon nodded, but didn't move. He glanced back into the room, where Gloria and Tyrell sat together, their tears a mixture of joy and release. "Let's give them a little more time," he said softly. For once, Elon Musk wasn't thinking about deals, technology, or empires. He was thinking about the power of a single moment, of kindness given without expectation, of lives changed by selflessness. And as he turned to step outside, he smiled faintly, knowing this wouldn't be the end of his connection to the young man who had saved his family. The sunlight was starting to fade when Tyrell, and his mother sat on the back porch of their new home. The air was quiet, filled only with the gentle rustle of leaves in the trees. Gloria sat in the wooden swing, her hands resting in her lap as she gazed out over the yard. Her eyes, still red from earlier tears, were full of something Tyrell hadn't seen in years. Peace. Tyrell sat beside her, leaning back against the railing. The weight in his chest was lighter now, though he still felt as though the world might shift at any moment and take all this away. "You like it, Mama?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Gloria looked at him, her face glowing in the golden light. "I love it, Tyrell. I don't know how I'll ever stop thanking God for this house, and for you." He smiled faintly, staring at his hands. "You deserve it, Mama." Before Gloria could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made them both turn. The rumble of an engine was familiar, but what came next sent Tyrell's heart racing. A knock at the front door. "I'll get it," Tyrell said, rising quickly and moving through the house. We opened the door. Elon Musk stood there once again, this time alone, dressed more casually in dark slacks and a button-down shirt. A manila envelope rested in his hands. "Elon's?" Tyrell asked, stunned. "What are you doing here?" Elon smiled faintly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No, sir, not at all," Tyrell replied, stepping back. "Come in." Elon shook his head, his expression calm but serious. "I won't stay long. I just needed to give you something." Tyrell blinked, his eyes darting to the envelope. "What is it?" Elon stepped forward, pressing the envelope gently into Tyrell's hands. "Call it unfinished business." Tyrell frowned, glancing up at him. "I told you I didn't want anything for myself, sir. You already gave us more than I could ever ask for." Elon's smile deepened, his eyes sharp with understanding. "I know you did, Tyrell, and that's exactly why I'm giving this to you." Tyrell hesitated, his heart pounding as he carefully opened the flap of the envelope. Inside, there was a thick piece of paper with a letterhead that seemed official. As he pulled out and unfolded it, his breath caught in his chest. "Congratulations. You have been awarded a full scholarship to the college of your dreams, anywhere in the world." Tyrell's hands shook as he stared at the words, his vision blurring. He reread it, certain he must have misunderstood. "What?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "What is this?" "It's your future," Elon said simply, his voice steady. "When you told me you didn't want anything for yourself, it struck me. You're the kind of person who would give up everything for someone you love. But you deserve a chance to dream, Tyrell, a chance to make something of yourself." Tyrell looked up, his chest tight. "I can't." "You can," Elon interrupted gently. "You told me about your mother's sacrifices, but what about yours? You work, you struggle, you carry this responsibility. But I saw something in you. You're smart, Tyrell, driven. And I refuse to let someone like you slip through the cracks just because life didn't deal you the best hand." Tyrell's tears spilled before he could stop them. He clutched the letter like it was something sacred, something he'd never let go. "I don't even know what to say," he choked out. Elon's gaze softened. "Say you'll use it. Say you'll dream bigger than you ever thought possible." Tyrell let out a shaky breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't deserve this." "Yes, you do," Elon said firmly. "People like you, selfless, humble, good, are the reason the world still has hope. And that's something I'll never forget." Before Tyrell could say more, Gloria appeared in the hallway behind him, her voice soft but full of emotion. "What's going on?" Tyrell turned to her slowly, holding up the letter with trembling hands. "Mama, he gave me a scholarship." Gloria's face crumpled as she covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Scholarship? For you. Anywhere I want to go," Tyrell whispered, his voice breaking. Gloria rushed forward, wrapping her arms tightly around him. "Praise God. Praise God," she sobbed. "My boy, you're going to college." Elon watched quietly, a small smile on his lips. He didn't speak, letting the weight of the moment wash over them. When Gloria finally pulled back, she turned to Elon, her voice shaking with gratitude. Mr. Musk, I don't even have words. You've changed our lives. Elon shook his head gently. Your son changed mine. Gloria stared at him, as if trying to understand his words. Elon offered one final nod before stepping back toward the door. Tyrell, he said softly, don't ever stop believing in yourself. You've earned this. Tyrell wiped his eyes, nodding hard. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Elon gave him one last smile before slipping out into the dusk, leaving the Williams family standing together in the warm light of their new home. That night, as Tyrell sat alone in his room, the letter spread out on his bed in front of him. He couldn't stop staring at it. For years, college had been an impossible dream, something only for other people. But now, it was real. He traced the words on the paper with his fingers, whispering to himself, I'm really going. Outside his window, the world was quiet, but inside, something had changed. For the first time in his life, Tyrell felt like he could see beyond the limits of his neighborhood, beyond the cracked sidewalks and flickering porch lights. And for the first time, he let himself dream. It didn't take long for the story to spread. By the next morning, the quiet streets of Southside Atlanta buzzed with activity. News vans lined the block, their bright logos glaring against the cracked pavement. Reporters in pressed suits stood with microphones in hand, cameras capturing every corner of the Williams' old neighborhood. Tyrell watched it all unfold from a living room window, his heart sinking slightly. The neighborhood had always been a place of loud voices and laughter, but this was different. This was something else entirely, something Tyrell wasn't sure he wanted. Tyrell. Mrs. Jenkins' voice boomed from outside. Boy, you better smile for these cameras. You're famous now. He groaned softly, stepping back from the window. Mama, he called, turning toward the kitchen, where Gloria was scrubbing down their counter like the world hadn't just turned upside down. Why are they here? Gloria looked up, arching an eyebrow. Because you did something good, baby. People want to know about it. Tyrell sighed, flopping onto the couch. I don't like it. Gloria set down her rag and walked over, resting her hands on her hips. Tyrell, look at me. He sat up, meeting her eyes. God doesn't give moments like this to just anyone. You didn't ask for this attention, but it found you anyway. Now what matters is what you do with it. Before Tyrell could respond, there was a knock at the door, sharp and impatient. Gloria shot him a pointed look before heading toward it. Tyrell groaned again, sinking deeper into the couch. When the door opened, voices spilled into the house. Mrs. Williams, is Tyrell here? Could we get a quick interview? We just want to know how it feels to be called a hero. Gloria's voice cut through the chaos, firm but polite. One at a time, y'all. He'll speak, but you better treat him right. She turned back toward Tyrell and called out, come on now, baby. You can't hide forever. Tyrell sighed heavily and stood, wiping his palms on his jeans as he walked outside. The sunlight hit him hard as he stepped onto the porch. A dozen reporters turned their cameras on him instantly, their lenses like a wall of blinking eyes. His neighbors were gathered around, watching with pride. Mrs. Jenkins stood front and center, grinning ear to ear like she just won the lottery. Tyrell, one reporter called, shoving a microphone toward him. You saved the wife of one of the most powerful men in the world. How does it feel to be a hero? Tyrell shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I don't know about being a hero, he muttered. The reporters pressed in closer. But you risked your life. Most people wouldn't have done that. Tyrell glanced at his neighbors, people who had watched him grow up, who had helped raise him alongside his mother. He saw Mr. Harris nodding proudly from his porch and the little kids watching him wide-eyed, their faces shining with curiosity. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, I just did what anybody should do. The reporters exchanged glances, clearly wanting more. But why didn't you accept the reward money? One of them pushed. Most people would have taken it without a second thought. Tyrell looked straight into the nearest camera, his voice calm but steady. My mama always taught me that the value of a person isn't in what they have, it's in what they do for others. She worked her whole life to give me what little we had. If I could give her something back, a real home. I didn't need anything more than that." The crowd fell silent. The reporters froze for a moment, as though the weight of Tyrell's words had knocked the wind out of them. Gloria, standing behind him on the porch, covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes shining with tears. The neighbors began to murmur, nodding in agreement. "That's right," Mrs. Jenkins called proudly. "This boy's got a heart of gold." A young female reporter stepped forward, her voice softer than the others. "Tyrell," she said, "what do you hope people take away from your story?" Tyrell paused, choosing his words carefully. He looked down the street at the kids running barefoot on the pavement, at the tired faces of his neighbors who worked too many hours for too little pay. Finally, he looked back at the camera. "I hope people remember that it doesn't take money to do the right thing," he said quietly. "You don't have to be rich or powerful to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is being willing to help." The silence that followed was almost reverent. The reporters lowered their microphones slightly, as though realizing they had found something rare, something genuine. Mr. Harris broke the quiet with a sharp clap of his hands. "That's the kind of young man we raised here," he shouted, pride in every word. The crowd erupted in cheers. Neighbors hugged one another, clapping Tyrell on the back as he tried to shrink into himself. "All right, that's enough," Gloria called out, stepping forward like a fierce lioness protecting her cub. "Y'all heard what he said. Now let my boy breathe." The reporters chuckled softly, beginning to pack up their gear. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Jenkins squeezed Tyrell's arm. "You keep your head up, Tyrell. The world needs more like you." "Thank you, ma'am," Tyrell said, ducking his head shyly. That evening, Tyrell and Gloria sat on the couch, watching the news play out on their small television. The screen showed clips of Tyrell's interview, his words played over soft music, and the image of their new home. Gloria wiped at her eyes with a tissue as she listened. "They're calling you a hero, baby," she said softly. Tyrell shook his head, his voice low. "I'm just me, Mama." She smiled through her tears. "And that's enough." As the news report ended, the anchor's voice echoed one last time. Sometimes, it's the quietest acts of kindness that make the loudest impact. Tyrell leaned back against the couch, staring at the screen as the image faded to black. He didn't feel like a hero, but maybe, just maybe, his story could remind someone else to be brave, to be kind, and to give without asking for anything in return. And that, he thought, was enough. Far from Southside Atlanta, in a sprawling mansion perched on the California hills, Elon Musk sat in his private study. The room, lined with shelves of books and futuristic gadgets, felt unusually quiet. The glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the walls as Elon leaned back in his chair, a glass of water untouched on the desk in front of him. The TV was on, playing the evening news. Tyrell Williams, the young man who risked his life to save Claire Musk and her unborn child, has become a symbol of selflessness and hope. His humility and courage have resonated far beyond Atlanta, with people across the country calling him a true hero. Elon's gaze was fixed on the screen. It showed Tyrell's interview from earlier that day. The boy's words had been simple, unpolished, but they carried more weight than any speech Elon had ever heard. You don't have to be rich or powerful to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is being willing to help. Elon pressed the pause button, letting those words hang in the air. Claire walked into the room quietly, her steps soft against the hardwood floor. She carried a cup of tea, her rounded belly now showing more prominently. She had recovered well from the accident, though the memory of it still lingered in her eyes. Still watching that, she asked gently, setting the tea on the desk. Elon nodded, his face thoughtful. "I can't stop thinking about him." Claire sat down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "He's special, isn't he?" "He is," Elon said quietly. He didn't ask for anything. Not for himself, anyway. Who does that anymore? Claire smiled faintly. Someone who was raised right. Someone who values the things money can't buy. Elon exhaled deeply, leaning forward in his chair. "It makes me think, how much have I really done for people like him? Kids who are smart, capable, but stuck in places where no one ever sees them. Claire tilted her head, her voice soft. You've changed the world, Elon. Space travel, electric cars, clean energy. You've done more than most people could ever dream of. But have I changed lives? He asked, his tone sharp with self-reflection. Not on the grand scale. The numbers, the progress. I mean, individual lives. Have I ever done something that made someone like Tyrell believe they could be more? Claire was quiet for a moment. Maybe this is your chance to start. Elon turned to her, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. What do you mean? She smiled knowingly. You've already changed his life. Now, what if you could do that for hundreds of kids like him? Thousands. The idea settled into the room like a spark waiting to catch fire. Elon straightened in his chair, his mind already racing. He thought of Tyrell's neighborhood, the crumbling houses, the underfunded schools, the kids playing in the streets with scraped knees and big dreams. For so long, Elon had focused on reaching the stars. Maybe it was time to focus on the ground beneath him. The next morning, Elon sat in a conference room with his executive team. The walls were sleek, the chairs expensive, but his tone was sharp and urgent. We're launching a new initiative, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. A program that finds young people like Tyrell, kids with potential but no resources, and gives them the tools they need to succeed. Scholarships, mentorships, funding for schools in underprivileged areas. I don't care how much it costs. Make it happen. His executives exchanged glances, surprised but nodding in agreement. What should we call it? One of them asked. Elon paused, leaning back in his chair. He thought of Tyrell, his quiet strength, his humility, his unwavering love for his mother. Finally, he smiled faintly. The Tyrell Williams Project. Later that evening, Tyrell sat in the living room of their new home, flipping through a stack of college brochures. Gloria was crocheting on the couch, her soft hum filling the room. The quiet peace of their new life was still unfamiliar, but it was something Tyrell cherished deeply. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up, frowning at the unfamiliar number. Hello? Tyrell, came the familiar voice. It's Elon. Tyrell sat up straighter. Mr. Musk, is everything okay? Everything's fine, Elon said, his tone warm. I just wanted to let you know something. You've inspired me, Tyrell. What you did, who you are, it reminded me of what really matters. Because of you, we're starting a program to help kids like you, to make sure no one with potential gets left behind just because of where they were born. Tyrell blinked, stunned. A program? Yes, Elon said firmly. We're calling it the Tyrell Williams Project. I hope it lives up to your name. Tyrell's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you, sir. I don't even know what to say." You don't need to say anything, Elon replied. Just keep being the person who made this possible. As the call ended, Tyrell sat in silence, the phone still clutched in his hand. His mother looked up from her crocheting, her brow furrowing slightly. Who was that? She asked. Tyrell looked at her, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. It was Elon Musk. He's starting something big, and he named it after me. Gloria's face softened, her eyes shimmering with tears. Oh, baby, she whispered, her voice thick with pride. Tyrell leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling as a deep sense of purpose filled him. For the first time, he realized that his story, their story, wasn't just about them anymore. It was about what could happen when someone chose kindness over greed, love over pride, and hope over fear. And it was just the beginning.